The wolf was still there. Sarah felt it the moment she crossed the threshold of the fitting room, in the way the air changed, not temperature, not sound, but pressure, some atmospheric weight that pressed against her sternum and made her breathing go careful and shallow. She had felt it yesterday, too, when she had brought the altered ceremonial cloak to the 3rd floor for final inspection, and the day before that, when she had stayed late to finish the silver button-work on the king's winter coat. Each time, the sensation had arrived before she understood it, before she could name it or set it aside or explain it away with anything sensible. It was not dread, not excitement, something older than either, something that lived below language and simply knew. She set the garment box on the cutting table and opened it with her usual efficiency, folding back the tissue paper in 2 neat movements. The coat lay inside. Black wool, high collar, silver closures she had spent the better part of 3 evenings setting by hand because the previous seamstress had used the wrong gauge and the closures had pulled wrong at the shoulder. Sarah had taken the whole right side apart and rebuilt it. No one had asked her to. No one had noticed the error except her, and she had corrected it because a wrong thing left wrong was its own kind of decision, and she had never been comfortable with that kind of passivity. The pressure in the room intensified. She went still, her hands flat on the folded tissue paper, and made herself breathe evenly. The fitting room occupied the northeast corner of the palace's east residential wing, 2 floors above the main hall. It was a practical room. North-facing windows for true light, a long mirror framed in dark oak, a raised platform for standing measurements, a single upholstered chair in the corner that no one ever sat in. There were no decorations. There were no embellishments. It was a room that existed to serve a function, and Sarah had always appreciated it for that. There was a wolf in the doorway. She did not turn immediately. This was not courage, or its opposite. It was simply that she had learned, somewhere in the 7 years she had worked in the palace workrooms, that abrupt reactions tended to make difficult situations more difficult, and that stillness cost nothing while panic cost considerably more than it was worth. So she finished smoothing the tissue paper back into its original fold, and then she turned. The wolf was enormous. This was the first thing, and the only thing, for a full 2 seconds, the sheer scale of it. It stood in the doorway with its shoulders nearly filling the frame, its coat the dense gray-black of deep winter cloud, and it was looking directly at her, not past her, not in her general direction, at her, with an attention so complete and particular that Sarah's hands, which she had thought were entirely still, began to tremble very slightly at the wrist. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the palace had heard of it. The king's wolf had not been seen in 150 years, not in any documented account anyone could verify, not since the reign of his father's father. When the wolf had last walked these corridors, and the court had arranged itself around it with a deference so automatic it was nearly biological. The histories said the wolf had gone inward, had retreated to some interior place the king alone inhabited, and that this was by the king's choosing, a deliberate and total suppression that had lasted longer than most living wolves had been alive. The historians wrote of it as a peculiarity of grief, or of a political decision so old its original reason had been almost entirely buried by time. The seamstresses in the workroom spoke of it in the way of people who repeat stories, told to them by people who were also repeating stories, with just enough distance to disclaim accuracy, and just enough relish to keep the telling alive. The wolf stood in the doorway of the fitting room and looked at Sarah. It was not behaving the way she would have expected a wolf of that size and history and power to behave. It was not prowling. It was not asserting. It stood with a stillness that matched her own, its great head level, its pale eyes, not gold, not green, something between them, the color of old amber in low light, entirely fixed. If she had been required, under honest conditions, to describe the quality of that gaze, she would have said it was considering. careful and considering, and not at all what she had imagined when she had imagined, on the rare occasions she allowed herself to imagine it, what the king's wolf, unseen for 150 years, would look like if it ever came back. She had not imagined it would look like this. She had not imagined it would look like it recognized her. "I am going to keep working," she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that, in a detached way, the way she was grateful for small practical things that kept larger situations from becoming catastrophic. "If that's all right." The wolf did not move. Sarah turned back to the coat, lifted it carefully from the box, and held it up to the north-facing window to check the collar seam in true light. Her pulse was doing something she would have preferred it not to be doing, but her hands, after those first few seconds, had stopped trembling, and the wolf, behind her, remained. It stayed the entire time she worked. When she left an hour later, it was gone from the doorway. She did not know when it had left. She had not heard it go. The corridor outside was empty and ordinary, and the air, without that particular pressure, felt thinner than it had before, like something had been present that she had not known was absent until it arrived, and now that it was gone, the lack of it announced itself in a way the presence had not. She walked back to the workrooms. She did not tell anyone what had happened. There was no one in particular she would have told. The collar seam had been perfect. The seamstress's workroom occupied the lowest level of the east wing, down a stone corridor that the torches always seemed to underserve, so that there was perpetually a quality of dimness to the walk, regardless of the hour. Sarah had made her peace with this 7 years ago, the same week she had made her peace with the workroom's single north-facing window, which provided excellent light for an hour in the morning, and then became functionally irrelevant for the rest of the day. She had addressed this problem by keeping a row of oil lamps along the shelf above her primary work table, and by positioning her chair at the precise angle that caught the window light during that one good hour and made the most of it. These were the kinds of adjustments she made as a matter of course, without complaint and without announcement, because the alternative was to spend her days straining her eyes in inadequate light, and she had too much work to do for that. The workroom held 4 seamstresses and 1 embroiderer. The embroiderer, a woman named Day, occupied the far corner with her frames and her silk threads and her fine-pointed tools, and she and Sarah had arrived at an arrangement over the years that functioned very well. Sarah did not disturb Day's threads, and Day left the second-best pair of scissors in the drawer where Sarah could reach them without asking. This was the whole of their relationship, and both parties found it sufficient. The other 3 seamstresses were younger than Sarah, which Sarah did not mind, and less experienced, which Sarah also did not mind, because experience was simply time applied to attention, and she had no strong feelings about being the person in a room who had been applying attention for longest. What she minded on occasion was the tendency of inexperience to produce confident assessments of things the speaker did not fully understand, a tendency that had twice in the last year resulted in garments being delivered to the upper floors with errors that Sarah had caught at the last possible moment by staying late and checking finished work that was not strictly her responsibility to check. She had not reported these errors. She had corrected them. The distinction felt important to her, though she could not always articulate precisely why. Her official title in the palace records was Senior Seamstress, 3rd grade. There was no 2nd grade and no 1st grade currently in residence. The gradations existed in the administrative structure as placeholders for positions that had been formally vacated over the past decade as the previous holders retired or left service, and that had not been refilled. Sarah occupied the highest grade present, which conferred no additional authority, and a slightly increased allotment of lamp oil per month. She used the lamp oil. The morning after the wolf appeared in the fitting-room doorway, she arrived at the workroom before the others, as she usually did, and set about organizing the day's work. There were 2 ordinary household commissions on the table, lining repairs for a steward's formal jacket, a let-out on a housekeeper's winter skirt, and one item that had been left without explanation or instructions, a folded piece of wool in a blue-gray so dark it was nearly black, with a note tucked beneath it that read simply, "For assessment." She unfolded the wool and examined it. It was old, at least 3 decades, possibly closer to 5. It had been stored carefully. There was no moth damage, no fading at the folds. But the weave had an irregularity in the 3rd quarter of the length that suggested a tension shift during the original making, and the selvage on the right-hand side had been hand-finished in a technique she had seen in only one other garment in her years at the palace, the grey travelling cloak she had repaired 2 years ago, which had been logged in the inventory as original to the reign before the current one. She set it aside. She would need to look at the inventory records before she wrote up the assessment. This was not her most pressing task of the morning, but it was the kind of task that had a way of being important long before its importance became apparent, and Sarah had learned to trust that quality in work. By mid-morning, the other seamstresses had arrived. The fire had been built up properly in the grate, and the workroom had settled into its ordinary rhythm of cut fabric, thread, and the specific silence that accumulated around people doing precise things that required concentration. Sarah was halfway through the steward's lining when she became aware that the youngest of the other seamstresses, a girl 2 years into her apprenticeship, was watching her from across the workroom with the expression of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for a considerable amount of time. "You were in the north fitting room yesterday," the girl said. "Yes." "Was it—" A pause. "They're saying you saw something in the corridor." Sarah did not look up from her work. "Who is saying that?" "I don't know. Maret heard it from one of the hall stewards." "Maret hears many things," Sarah said. This was accurate rather than unkind. Maret was the oldest of the younger 3, and she had a particular talent for gathering information from adjacent departments, which she then held and distributed with the careful economy of someone who understood the value of what she possessed. "The north fitting room is an ordinary room. I brought the king's winter coat up for a final inspection." The girl considered this for a moment, then nodded and returned to her work. The matter dropped, but across the room, Day's thread needle paused for exactly 2 seconds before resuming its path through the silk, and Sarah filed this away in the same quiet internal ledger where she kept most of the things she noticed. She told no one about the wolf. Not because she was protecting a secret exactly, but because the right words for what had happened in that room had not arrived yet, and Sarah had no interest in offering an account of an experience she did not yet understand. The wolf had been there. It had looked at her as though it knew her. It had stayed while she worked. She had checked the collar seam, and it had been perfect. These were the facts. Everything else was interpretation, and she was not yet ready to interpret. At the end of the day, as she banked the workroom fire and covered her tools, the piece of dark blue-gray wool caught her eye again from the shelf where she had set it. She reached out and touched the selvage edge, running her thumb along the hand-finished stitching. 50 years old, perhaps. Made during a time when the king's wolf still walked the palace corridors, before whatever grief or decision had drawn it inward and kept it there for a century and a half. She covered the wool with a clean cloth and went home. 3 days passed without incident. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, she arrived at the fitting room for a standard consultation. One of the household guards needed adjustments to a formal dress uniform, and found the space occupied in a way she had not expected. The king was standing at the window. He was not, at first glance, remarkable. This was a thing she had noted about him before, on the 3 other occasions she had been in the same room, that he did not present himself the way she would have imagined a man of his age and power and history would present himself. He was not dramatic. He was not performing anything. He stood at the window with his hands loosely at his sides and his attention directed at something in the courtyard below, and he might, from a certain angle, and with a certain amount of willful misreading, have been any one of a dozen palace officials of above-average height and somewhat unusual stillness. From any other angle, he was clearly not. He was older than the oldest wolves in current court service. He was older than any law that governed the court he ruled. He had, as the histories recorded with the flat precision of people documenting the unremarkable, watched the palace stoneware and be replaced in 3 complete cycles, had outlasted the family lines of every adviser who had ever served him, and had continued the business of governance with a consistency that was, depending on the source one consulted, either a remarkable achievement of will or simply what happened when a creature strong enough to outlast ordinary time chose not to stop. His face, as it always did, produced in Syrah a kind of cognitive friction, the knowledge of the centuries he carried set against the physical evidence, which offered nothing to confirm it. He looked like a man in early middle years. He looked like a man who had been that way for a very long time. He turned from the window when she entered. She set her kit on the table. "I wasn't told the room was occupied. I can come back." "Don't." He paused. "The guard has been rescheduled. You're not in the wrong room." Sarah kept her hands moving, setting out her tools in their usual order. The measuring tape, the chalk, the pins in their cloth roll. She was aware of being watched, but this was not a new experience, and she had long since arrived at a working relationship with the sensation of being observed. She did not perform for it, and she did not pretend it wasn't happening. "All right." "The coat," he said. "The right shoulder. Someone took it apart." "Yes." "And reclosed the seam." "The original closures were pulling. The gauge was wrong. If it had been worn as it was, the seam would have failed within 2 seasons." She looked up briefly. "I noted it in the work record." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've been told the workroom didn't report an error." "It wasn't formally an error. The original work was signed off." She turned back to her kit. "I corrected it. The reason it was wrong seemed less important than the fact of it being wrong." He was quiet again. The quality of his quiet was unlike most people's quiet. It was not empty, and it was not waiting. It was occupied in the way that significant things were occupied, full of something she could not read from outside it. Sarah, who spent most of her professional life reading the things clothes revealed about the bodies and habits of the people who wore them, found this mildly frustrating and did not allow herself to show it. "You've worked in the workroom for 7 years, he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "Senior seamstress, 3rd grade." "Yes." "There's no one above you?" "Not currently. The positions were vacated over the past decade." She began re-rolling the measuring tape, which she had unrolled and not used. "It's an administrative remnant. The grades don't affect the work." He took 1 step away from the window. It was not a step toward her. It was simply a repositioning, a small change in his orientation relative to the room. But she felt the pressure in the air shift with it, that same atmospheric change she had felt 3 days ago in this exact space, and her hands went briefly still before she made them continue. "Do you know," he said, "what was seen in the corridor outside this room 3 days ago?" Sarah considered her answer. "I know what I saw," she said. "What others reported I haven't heard directly." "What did you see?" She met his eyes. They were a gray that had no warmth in it, or very little, and they were measuring her with an attention she recognized as genuine assessment rather than performance. She gave him the same quality back, because she had nothing else to offer and no particular interest in pretending otherwise. "I saw the wolf," she said, "in the doorway. It stayed while I worked. It was gone when I left." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She counted them, not because she was nervous, but because she had a habit of measuring things. "Yes," he said. That was all. He left a short time after without further ceremony, and the guard's appointment was quietly rescheduled to the following morning, and Sarah stayed in the fitting room and finished cataloging her kit, and outside the north-facing windows, the early winter sky was the particular shade of pale gray that came just before the first serious snow of the season. She thought about the quality of that single word. Yes, not an explanation, not a comfort, not a declaration of any kind, simply a confirmation that she had seen correctly. She found she respected that. She was not wrong then. She had not imagined it. This was not a relief, exactly, but it was a fact, and she could work with facts, which was more than she could say for most of the other things the situation was pressing in her direction. She folded her kit, tucked it under her arm, and walked back down the dim stone corridor toward the workroom. Behind her, at the end of the hall, one of the high casement windows showed a single line of pale winter light along the floor. She did not look back at it, but she noticed it, and the noticing stayed with her the rest of the afternoon, sitting at the back of her attention like a small warm weight she had not been carrying before. The snow arrived that evening. It fell softly, without drama, a quiet accumulation through the night that left the palace grounds white and hushed by morning. The sound of footsteps in the corridors changed, somehow, as though the building itself had muffled its own breathing. Sarah walked to work through it with her coat buttoned to the chin, her breath making small clouds, and noticed that the light off the snow was remarkable. A flat silver white that turned the whole world into something illuminated from no particular direction, clean and directionless and honest. She had 2 new commissions on her table when she arrived. The first was routine. The second was not. It bore the king's household seal. She broke it without ceremony and read the instruction inside. A request for assessment and restoration of 1 antique garment, with additional consultation services to follow, to be scheduled at the fitter's convenience. The phrasing was old-fashioned in a specific way she recognized from the administrative forms she had reviewed when first cataloging the workroom's historic accounts, the phrasing of the palace's previous organizational era, when the workrooms were considered direct household dependencies rather than administrative departments. Someone had chosen it deliberately. She could not tell if this was habit or intention. She set the note down and considered what it meant that the instruction had come to her specifically, rather than to the workroom supervisor, who technically held the authority for external commissions, or to the broader household accounting office through which most formal requests were routed. The instruction had not been misdirected. The direction had been precise. She was being contracted directly, which was either a procedural irregularity so minor it would go unnoticed, or one significant enough to generate a formal objection from the administrative structure above her. She folded the note and tucked it under the edge of her lamp, where it would be visible but not prominent. The antique garment arrived that afternoon, the same blue-gray wool she had examined 3 days ago, now accompanied by a brief record card. The card listed the garment as a traveling cloak, original manufacture approximately 52 years ago, previous alterations none, condition fair. There was a single additional line at the bottom, added in a different hand from the rest, worn once. Sarah sat with this for a moment. 52 years, worn once, no alterations. She unfolded the cloak slowly, laying it flat across the large examination table and working from the hem upward, taking it in section by section. The construction was meticulous. She had known it was meticulous from her first handling, but seeing it fully unfolded and in the morning lamplight she could appreciate the degree of it. This was not a court seamstress's work, done to a specification and a deadline. This was someone who had cared about the work for its own sake. The seams were hand-finished throughout, each stitch the same length, without variation or any of the small accumulated fatigue that showed up in long, hand-sewn runs when the workers' attention had drifted. Whoever had made this cloak had not let their attention drift. The tension irregularity she had identified in the 3rd quarter was exactly where she had expected it. a slight drawing in of the weave over about 9 inches of length in the middle of the back panel. She examined it under the lamp. It was not a flaw in the construction. It was a repair. Someone had let out a seam along the back panel long ago, and the original weave had contracted around the alteration point in the decades since. The seam beneath was still sound, but the tension differential was working on it slowly, and if the cloak were ever worn again, even once, it would begin to go at that point. She sat back and looked at the whole of it. 52 years, one wearing. A repair that predated the current seamstress by at least 2 decades, done in a style that matched the original construction almost perfectly, which meant the repair had been done by the original maker. She wrote up her assessment carefully. She included the tension differential, the repair history, the projected failure point, and her recommended intervention. At the bottom, she added a note. This garment was made with uncommon skill. The repair was done with equal care by the same hand. The intervention I recommend is minimal. I would rather preserve what is here than impose corrections over it. She sent it upstairs with the afternoon courier. The response came back within 2 hours, which was faster than any administrative response she had received in 7 years of palace employment. It was 3 words. When can you start? She did not allow herself to read anything into the speed of the response, or into the directness of the phrasing, or into any of the other details that were quietly accumulating in the internal ledger she kept, the one she had started the night the wolf appeared in the doorway and had been adding to, without quite acknowledging it, every day since. She simply noted the response, noted the speed, and wrote back with a day and a time. This was the nature of her work. Someone brought her something damaged or uncertain, or in need of careful attention, and she brought it her whole attention, and she did not look past the seam she was working on to the implications of the garment it belonged to. This was the skill and the discipline, and on its best days it was also the grace of it. She smoothed the assessment record, filed her copy in the workroom's catalogue, and began clearing her table for the following morning's start. Outside the window, the winter light was already going. The snow on the ground caught the last of it and held it longer than the sky did, a slow silver fade that made the whole world look like something drawn in charcoal and not yet finished. Sarah watched it for a moment, her hands still on the table's edge, and then the lamp above her drew her eyes back to the work. She had 3 things to do before she could leave. She did all 3. The consultation room on the 2nd floor was nothing she had been in before. It was not grand. It had the same northern light, the same stone floor softened by a single old rug, the same plain functionality of the rooms she generally worked in. But it had, in addition to the standard fitter's table, a long shelf along the east wall that held what she realized, after a moment, were sample records, folded swatches of fabric organized by period, each tagged with a small card in a fine, consistent handwriting that she recognized from the note on the bottom of the record card. Worn once. He was there when she arrived. This was the 3rd time in 2 weeks they had been in the same room, and Sarah, whose professional practice was built on the principle of not adding interpretation to evidence until the evidence required it, was running up against the limits of that principle. Because the evidence was becoming fairly insistent. He had been in the fitting room when she arrived. He had responded to her assessment in 2 hours. He was here now, standing beside the shelf of sample records, in a room that was not his office and was not a formal consultation space and had no obvious reason to be the location for this meeting. She set the cloak on the table and unfolded it in her usual manner. "The tension differential I noted," she said, "runs across the back panel in this direction." She indicated the line with her finger without touching the fabric yet. "The repair beneath it is sound, but the differential is putting lateral stress on the original seam below. If I address just the surface irregularity, I solve the visible problem and leave the structural issue. I'd rather go in once and address both." He came to stand on the other side of the table. He looked at where she was pointing without looking at her, which she found easier than the alternative. "And the cloak's structure," he said. "Is it salvageable for use?" "Yes. It's in remarkable condition for its age. Whoever stored it knew what they were doing. A pause. The original maker knew what they were doing too. The intervention I'd recommend is careful, nothing that would overwrite the original construction. That matters to you. Good work deserves to be preserved as what it is. She met his eyes briefly, rather than replaced with something easier to assess. He was silent, and again, that quality of his silence, occupied, full, carrying something she could not locate from outside. Her shoulder ached in a way it sometimes did at the end of a long day, a residual tension between her neck and the top of her arm that she had grown accustomed to and generally ignored. She became aware of it now as if noticing it for the first time. "The cloak was my mother's," he said. She had suspected something like this. Not necessarily this specifically, but something that explained the age and the care and the worn ones. She kept her expression even. "I didn't know you had records of her work." "I don't, not formally." He touched the edge of the table, not the cloak. "She made this herself. The alteration was also hers. She made it the last winter she was alive. She had a way of working." He stopped. The stop was not distress, or not only distress. It was more like the stop of a man who had held a sentence for a very long time and was now listening to how it sounded when someone else was in the room to hear it. "The regularity of the hand-stitching," Sarah said, quietly, filling the silence without filling it too much. "The stitch length. It doesn't vary." He looked at her. "I noticed it," she said. "That kind of consistency across a full back panel of handwork. That's not craft. That's how someone who genuinely loves what they're doing works. Their attention doesn't wander." He was very still. She understood abruptly why the wolf had stayed while she worked. Not because of who she was, not yet, but because the wolf had watched her in the same way she had just described his mother's stitching, with a complete attention that did not wander, that registered the quality of care in what it was looking at and knew the care for what it was. The wolf had recognized something in her work before either of them had exchanged a word. She looked back at the cloak. "I can preserve it," she said. "And if you want it to be wearable again, not as a museum piece, but actually worn, I can do that too. Both are possible. Which would you recommend? What would your mother have wanted for it?" The question surprised him. She could see it. A very slight recalibration, a fractional adjustment, as though the question had come from an unexpected angle. He looked at the cloak for a long moment. "For it to be used," he said. "Then I'll make it wearable." She drew the cloak toward her and began folding it for return to its case. "I'll need 2 weeks. The tension differential requires time. I can't rush the correction without risking the original seam, and I'd rather not risk the original seam." 2 weeks is fine." She finished folding, set the case closed, looked up. "One more thing." He waited. The silk thread in the hand finish along the left hem. It's a particular dye lot. I've only seen it once before, in a pair of formal gloves in the historical inventory. If I need to replace any of the hem thread, it won't match exactly. She paused. "I want you to know that before I start, so the decision about whether to accept that is yours, not mine." He looked at her with the measuring quality she recognized from their first exchange, the honest assessment. "You'd have been within your authority to just proceed," he said. "Yes, most would have. I know." The silence held. Somewhere below them, a door in the hall opened and closed, and the small domestic sound of it settled the room back into its ordinary proportions. "Use what you have," he said. "Do the best you can with it." "Yes," she said. "That's what I do." The objection came from the Household Administrative Office, formally addressed, on a Tuesday morning 11 days after Sarah had begun the cloak's restoration. She read it at her work table, the cloak folded carefully to the left, A section of the back panel opened before her where she had been working since 6 that morning. The letter was correct in its phrasing and impeccable in its structure, and it outlined, with the thorough precision of someone who had thought carefully about how to make an argument that could not be dismissed on technical grounds, 3 concerns about the arrangement under which she had been receiving the Restoration Commission. The first concern was procedural. External commissions above a certain assessed value were required to be routed through the Household Accounting Office, not issued directly to individual staff. The cloak's assessed restoration value, the letter noted, was above that threshold. The second concern was jurisdictional. Work on items belonging to the king's personal household was categorized as royal household service, which fell under the authority of the senior household steward, not the workroom. The workroom was an administrative department. Administrative departments did not directly service royal household commissions without a formal authorization on file. The third concern, the one she lingered on longest, was stated in the mildest possible terms, with the kind of careful neutrality that made its edge all the sharper for the restraint. The letter noted that the senior seamstress grade had not been formally reviewed or reconfirmed in 6 years, and that, given the above concerns, it would be prudent for the workroom's grading structure to be reviewed as part of the administrative clarification process. She set the letter down. She picked up the cloak and made 3 more stitches before she set it down too, because she was not going to rush the work because of paperwork and because the stitches were at a delicate juncture and needed her full attention. Then she got up and went to find the workroom's catalog records. The catalog records occupied a cabinet in the back of the workroom that no one touched except Sarah, because Sarah was the only person in the workroom who had ever cataloged anything into it. Over 7 years she had built a complete record of every commission received, completed, assessed, and logged, with dates and authorizing parties and the relevant administrative codes, and she had cross-referenced it against the palace's broader household records on 3 separate occasions when she had needed to verify provenance for restoration work. She knew exactly what was in this catalogue. She pulled the records for the last 6 years. Then she pulled the historical records for the previous decade, which were in a different section of the cabinet, and which she had organized herself after inheriting them in a state of considerable disorder from her predecessor. Then she went upstairs and requested the administrative authorization files from the Household Records Office, which were entitled to her inspection as a member of staff of her grade, and which she received without issue. She spent the remainder of the morning and the better part of the afternoon reading. What she found was not exactly what she had expected. It was more. The threshold value that the letter cited, the assessed value above which commissions required routing through the Household Accounting Office, had been established by a standing order issued 9 years ago. This standing order had itself been issued to clarify an earlier standing order, which had been issued in response to a procedural ambiguity that had arisen when the workroom's status was reclassified from a household department to an administrative department 12 years ago. The reclassification itself had been a broad administrative reform that had affected 8 departments, and it had been conducted without, as far as Sarah could determine from the records, any adjustment to the existing commission authorization structure. This meant that the commission authorization structure in the letter was built on a standing order that had been issued to clarify a procedure that had been created to address an ambiguity produced by a reclassification that the authorization structure had never been updated to reflect. She read this chain twice, slowly, to be certain she understood it correctly. She did. The chain was there, in writing, in the administrative records she had retrieved from a public office using a legitimate entitlement. No one had hidden it. It was simply that it had not been assembled in one place before, because assembling it required caring enough about the underlying accuracy of the structure to spend an afternoon doing the work. Sarah cared about the underlying accuracy of structures. She always had. This was not, she thought, a particular virtue. It was simply her nature, the same nature that made her reclose a coat seam that no one had asked her to reclose, the same nature that had her noting the stitch-length consistency in a 50-year-old cloak on first examination. She paid attention. She kept records. She did not assume that what was stated was what was true until she had satisfied herself of the truth's actual shape. She wrote up her response to the administrative office's letter in the same careful, neutral language the letter had used. She cited the standing order by number and date. She cited the reclassification order. She cited the 6-year gap in the authorization structure and the date on which the threshold value had been established. She noted that the direct commission had been received and accepted in good faith, and under the reasonable belief, well supported by the administrative record, that a personal household commission bearing the king's household seal was authorized by that seal itself, a precedent established in the palace records 40 years before the reclassification and never formally superseded. On the question of the grade review, she noted that the senior seamstress third grade designation was currently the only occupied grade in the workroom hierarchy, and that a review of the grade's validity would necessarily require a review of the commission authority for all workroom output over the past 6 years, since all workroom commissions during that period had been authorized under that grade. She noted this without editorial comment. The implication spoke for itself. She sealed the response, sent it by the internal post, and returned to the cloak. She still had 3 hours of good lamplight. She was not going to waste them. The response from the administrative office took 2 days. It arrived at the same time as a separate note from the Household Records Office, which had apparently conducted its own review during the interval. Both letters were brief. The first confirmed that, following review of the cited standing orders and authorization records, the direct commission arrangement was found to be within procedural compliance. The second confirmed that the senior seamstress third grade designation was current and valid. No further review was indicated. Maret, who had somehow obtained information about the existence of the first letter before Sarah had received her response, sat across the workroom with an expression of carefully neutral interest and said nothing at all, which was how Sarah knew the information had already traveled to at least 3 additional departments. She folded both responses into the catalogue, filed them under the cloak's commission record, and went back to work. The wolf came back on the evening of the 14th day. It came not to the fitting room, but to the workroom itself, the first time any non-staff presence had entered the workroom in the entire 7 years Sarah had worked there. She heard it before she saw it. The other seamstresses had already left for the evening, and she was alone with her lamps and the cloak, and then there was that pressure in the air, that shift in the room's atmospheric weight, and she looked up, and the wolf was in the doorway. She was not surprised. She had stopped at being surprised by it somewhere around the 5th or 6th day, in the quiet margin of attention she kept even while working, the part of her that had been noting accumulating evidence and declining to reach conclusions until the evidence required it. The evidence, she thought now, had required them for some time. She had simply needed to keep working. "Come in if you're going to come in," she said. "The draft from the corridor is bad for the thread." The wolf came in. It was, if anything, more imposing in the workroom than it had been in the fitting room. The fitting room had high ceilings. The workroom had low ones, and the wolf's shoulders were level with the top of the shelving unit along the near wall, and it moved through the space with the careful deliberateness of something very large that knows precisely how much space it occupies. It came to within a few feet of her table and settled. Not quite lying down, not entirely upright, a kind of watchful repose that she had come to understand over the course of these past weeks was simply how it was with her. It watched her work. She worked. The cloak was nearly done. She was finishing the hem thread replacement. The thread she had warned him about, the one that would not match exactly, the one that was close but not identical to the original dye lot because the original dye lot had been made 52 years ago, and existed now only in the 2 palace items it had originally been applied to. She had found a match from the archive stores that was within 2 shades. In ordinary light it would not be visible. In the very particular, exact, north-facing examination light of the fitting room at noon, there was a faint difference. She had noted it in the commission record. She had noted it to him directly before she began. The decision had been his, and he had made it. Do the best you can with it. She was doing the best she could with it. The hem is the last piece, she said to the wolf, because there was no reason not to. She had gotten into a habit over these evenings of speaking aloud while she worked, which she had not done before. She did not examine this habit too closely. 2 more evenings, maybe 3 if the thread runs difficult at the corner joins. Then it's done. The wolf made no sound. It watched her with those pale amber eyes, and it stayed, and the workroom was warm with the lamplight and the late fire, and outside the palace windows the deep winter dark pressed against the glass with its particular cold. The administrative matter resolved, she said. In case you were informed of it, I'm still on the commission. A pause in her stitching. She set the needle. I don't know why it comes here, she said. The wolf. I'm not going to pretend I haven't thought about it. She picked the needle back up. But I'm not going to pretend I know what it means either. I wanted you to know that I've thought about it, that I'm not treating it as something to be explained away or managed. The wolf breathed, a slow, quiet exhalation that moved the air between them very slightly, warm and pine dark, and something else, resin, cold stone, deep winter. And Sarah felt the ache in her shoulder again, the one between her neck and the top of her arm, warm and distinct and more present than it had ever been. She went still for a moment. Then she made the next stitch. He came to collect the cloak himself. She had expected a courier, a household steward, some appropriate intermediary. The way things were usually done, the way the administrative structure preferred things to be done, with appropriate channels and appropriate distance maintained. Instead, on the morning of the 16th day he came to the workroom. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared in the doorway at the end of the corridor while she was uncovering the finished work from its protective cloth, and she heard his footstep on the stone floor and turned. And there he was. She had, in the days since the administrative letter and its resolution, become more practiced at setting aside the things she noticed. This was a kind of discipline she had not needed before, and she was not entirely certain she approved of needing it. She noticed the way he moved through the workroom with the same careful precision as the wolf, the exact, unhurried awareness of the space around him and of everything in it. She noticed the way his eyes went immediately to the cloak, not to her, and then, 2 seconds later, to her, and then back to the cloak. She set these observations in the ledger and continued. "It's finished," she said. She drew the protective cloth back fully, and the cloak lay on the table in the full lamp light. The wolf had not come this morning. She had not expected it. In the days since the evening in the workroom, the visits had become something she simply accepted as part of the current shape of her days, and their absence, on the days it occurred, registered as the absence of something she had grown accustomed to, neither alarming nor surprising. This was, she understood, already a form of adjustment she had not consciously chosen to make. He stood at the table and looked at the cloak for a long moment. "The hem," he said, finally. "The thread is 2 shades away from the original. In this light you can see it if you know to look. In any other light you won't." He bent slightly, examining the corner join where the new thread met the old. She had been meticulous at the junctions. The join was nearly invisible even to her, and she knew exactly where it was. "If she were here," he said quietly, "she would not be able to find the join." Sarah did not answer immediately. Then, "The repair she made to the back panel, she knew what she was doing. The join I made is in her style, not mine. I worked backward from her technique." A pause. It seemed right. He straightened. He was looking at her with that full, honest attention, the attention she had come to recognize as distinct from courtesy or professional assessment, the attention that landed on her like the lamplight landing on the cloak. illuminating. She held it without looking away because she had decided, somewhere in the last 16 days, that looking away was a form of dishonesty she was not going to practice. "The wolf," he said. "Yes. You're not alarmed by it." "I was, at first. A little." She considered this. "Less alarmed than I was curious. It behaves—" She paused, choosing her words. "It behaves as though it's decided something. And I've found that things that have genuinely decided something are more reliable than things that are still making up their minds, even if I don't yet know what the decision was." Something shifted in his expression. Not a great shift. He was not a man who made large visible movements with his face. But something behind the gray eyes changed, and she felt it the way she felt a change in light quality, not as a dramatic event, but as an undeniable and immediate recalibration of everything she was seeing. 153 years, he said. She waited. Since the wolf came out, since it walked the palace. He looked at the cloak again, briefly. There was a reason for it going in. A reason I won't explain fully today. A pause. My wife died 153 years ago. The wolf went in when she died, and I held it in, and it stayed in, and I stopped. I stopped expecting it to do anything else. Sarah kept very still. It came out for the first time in this room, he said, while you were working. I didn't ask it to. I didn't expect it to. It simply... He stopped. The stop of a man listening to what his own words sounded like. It recognized something, he said. The work, she said carefully. The worker. The lamplight fell on the cloak between them. The cloak that his mother had made, that his wife had altered, that Sarah had restored with the best of her skill and the most careful attention she could bring. The full lineage of care, held in wool and thread and 52 years and one recent fortnight of patient, ordinary work. I'm not going to make promises I haven't thought through, he said, but I want you to know. What I am asking for isn't defined by what the wolf did or by any rule that applies to it. That is separate. He looked at her directly. I am asking because I am asking. Because I have been in this room and watched you work and listened to how you speak about the things you care about, and I am choosing to ask. She held his gaze. Her shoulder ached, warm and present and entirely impossible to ignore. What are you asking? To not have you be a person I only see in a workroom. To have you... A pause. Available. To talk to. To be in the same room with, while we both figure out what this is. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. She looked at the cloak, at the hem thread that was 2 shades away from the original in north-facing examination light, at the corner join that his mother would not have been able to find, at the repair in the back panel that had been made with love 52 years ago by a woman who had not let her attention wander. Yes, she said. He nodded once, a small, settled movement, the nod of someone who has put down something they had been carrying for a long time and is not yet accustomed to the absence of the weight. He took the cloak. He left. Sarah sat down at her table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Outside, the winter morning was doing what winter mornings did, pressing its gray light through the north-facing window, indifferent to the magnitude or the smallness of what happened in the rooms it illuminated. She sat in it for a while. Then she picked up the next commission from the pile on her left and opened it, because there was work to do, and the work would not do itself, and she had always been better at continuing than at stopping. 4 months passed. She did not count them exactly, but she felt them, felt the palace winter deepen, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to turn. The days lengthened by increments she noticed through her north-facing window, the good light in the morning lasting a 1/4 hour longer, then a 1/2 hour, than the first day in late winter when she realized she had not lit the second lamp by mid-afternoon and had not missed it. Spring arrived the way spring in a cold place always arrived, not with warmth, but with a lessening of cold, a subtraction rather than an addition. And then one morning the courtyard stones outside were wet rather than iced, and the change was simply there, unremarkable, decided. She and the king, she did not, in her private thoughts, call him by any other name yet, though he had offered it, and she had filed the offer in the ledger and returned to it on occasions when the ledger required her attention, had developed something over those 4 months that she found easier to characterize by its texture than by any formal name. They met 3 times a week in the second-floor consultation room, ostensibly over a rotating set of household textile questions that she was working through with a thoroughness that bore some relationship to professional obligation and some relationship to the fact that it gave them a structured reason to be in the same room. They talked about the work. They talked, more slowly and obliquely, about other things. He asked her questions and waded through her answers with a quality of attention she was not entirely used to. She asked him questions she had been sitting with for weeks, and he answered them with a plainness that occasionally surprised her, as though the directness of her asking met the directness of his answering, in some automatic way that bypassed the formal distance she would have expected. The wolf came to the workroom. Most evenings she stayed late. This fact had become known in the palace, in the way that significant facts became known, not by announcement, but by a gradual saturation of knowing through the bodies and instincts of the wolves around her. She had noticed the shift in the corridor outside the workroom. A household guard who had previously walked past without acknowledgement now moved a fraction of a foot wider as he passed. A palace official who had not previously met her eyes in the administrative hall held the outer door when he saw her coming. These were not large gestures. They were not even, she thought, conscious ones. They were the involuntary rearrangements of a building that was slowly, at the level of instinct, understanding something that had not yet been formally stated. She did not comment on the rearrangements. She noted them. She kept the note in the ledger, and she kept the ledger to herself, and she kept walking through the corridors in her usual manner, with her usual kit under her arm, and she kept doing the work. In early spring, the old archivist of the palace records, a man who had been in his role since before Sarah's birth, whose name was Councillor Arvin, and who communicated primarily through written notes delivered by a remarkably small page, sent her a folded document without explanation. She opened it at her work table. It was a historical record. It documented, in the formal notation of palace archive language, a period 400 years ago when a previous king's wolf had gone into a similar suppression following a loss, and the circumstances under which it had emerged. The circumstances were not identical to the present ones, but the record noted, in that same careful archival notation, that the wolf had emerged in response to the presence of a specific individual, a craftsperson, a maker of things, whose quality of attention to the work in front of them had somehow reached the wolf in whatever interior place it occupied, and had called it back out. At the bottom of the document, in Councillor Arvin's distinctive hand, was a single line. It is not the first time the wolf has known what the man was not yet ready to say. She sat with this for a long time. Then she wrote him a brief note and sent it up with the afternoon courier. It said, "I read the archive record Councillor Arvin sent. I thought you should know that I've read it." His response came back within the hour, as it always did now. "I asked him to send it. I wanted you to have the context. The wolf knew before I did. I am telling you that plainly because you deserve plain speech and I intend to give it to you." She held the note for a moment. Then she set it beside the lamp. Outside, the spring rain was beginning, a soft, persistent sound against the old stone of the palace walls, and the smell of it coming through the gap at the base of the north-facing window was the smell of wet earth and cold water, and something green beginning underneath, the particular smell of a world that has been cold for a long time and is starting, at last, to remember how to be otherwise. She picked up her needle and made the next stitch. By early summer, the consultation room meetings had quietly extended beyond the structured textile questions, which had themselves been completed. No one rescheduled them to any formal topic. They simply continued. The morning she arrived and found a chair at the table with a cup of tea on it, already poured, already cooled to the temperature she drank it at. Not too hot, because she had mentioned once in passing that she burned her mouth if she wasn't paying attention. She set down her kit and looked at the cup for a moment without saying anything. Then she sat down, wrapped both hands around the cup, and looked at him. "You've been here a while," she said. "A while," he agreed. The cup was one of the plain ones from the household kitchen, not the formal service, not anything that announced itself. Just a cup of tea at the right temperature on the table where she would find it. She drank it. Outside, the summer morning was doing what summer mornings did, arriving with an unhurried certainty, the light already full and clear through the north-facing window, the palace courtyard stones warm and dry below, the whole long day waiting in a way that felt not like demand but like availability. She set the empty cup down. "I would like to stay," she said. "Not because the wolf chose me, not because of what the archive record says or what the court is beginning to understand about us, because I am choosing to stay." A pause. "I wanted you to know the difference." He held her gaze. The gray of his eyes in the summer morning light was not cold. It had never been cold, she thought, only careful, and carefulness in a creature that had survived as long as he had was not coldness, but something else entirely, something that was patience and grief and a very old, very intact capacity for attention. "I know the difference," he said. "I was waiting for you to say it." The wolf came in through the open doorway and settled under the table, its great head on its forepaws, one pale amber eye half open and regarding the room with the expression of something that has been waiting a very long time for everyone else to catch up, and has not begrudged the wait, and is not about to start. Sarah looked down at it, then up at him. She had nothing more to say. Everything had been said. This was sufficient. This was the ordinary morning, and the cup was empty, and the light was on the table between them, and the wolf was still. The summer settled in the way of all things that arrive after a long cold, not with drama, not with announcement, but with a gradual certainty that this was the temperature of things now, that the cold had genuinely gone, and that the warmth was not a temporary condition to be held lightly in case it was taken back. Sarah still walked to the workroom in the mornings. She still had commissions on her table. She still lit the lamps along the shelf, though she needed fewer of them now, the summer light coming through the north-facing window and lasting well into the afternoon. She still did the work with the same full attention she had always brought to it, and the work was still exactly what it had always been, a damaged or uncertain or in need of care thing set in front of her, and her whole attention given to it, and the slow, patient process of making it sound again. The difference, in the mornings, was small and ordinary and complete. He was there. Not always in the workroom. He had a palace to govern and centuries of administrative obligation that did not pause for domestic rearrangements. But the mornings when he came and sat in the chair by the work table and drank his own tea and read his correspondence while she worked, those mornings had become, without ceremony or announcement, simply part of the shape of things. The wolf lay in the corner and watched, the way it always had, ways. The split in her boot seam, the one she had been meaning to address for the better part of a year, was repaired now. She had repaired it herself, one evening after work, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She had kept the boots. The repair was clean and sound. There was no reason to replace something still doing its job. The old cup, the plain household one, was always on her side of the table in the mornings now. She had not asked for it. It was simply there, and she had stopped remarking on it to herself, because some things, once they become the morning, stop requiring commentary and become simply the morning. It was not remarkable. It was simply hers, and his, and the wolf's, and the summer light through the north-facing window, and the plain cup, and the work waiting on the table, and the long, unhurried day ahead of them. And it was everything. Would you have stayed, kept working, kept turning up in a place that barely knew your name, long enough to find out what was watching? Let me know in the comments below.